Good morning, everyone. They are bright lights. So this morning I have brought a friend, a colleague, a leader in the gully remediation space of the Burdekin catchment. Scott probably doesn't need a lot of introduction as the CEO of NQ Dry Tropics. And let me have a look. I'd just firstly like to acknowledge we have a combination of a research team and a round of collaborators and contributors to that. A couple in the room, Scott Wilkinson here and Damon Telfer, are named, and a lot of others that are out in the paddock at the moment and aren't able to be here, but it was a big team effort. The other thing to mention is I'm presenting today on two NESP programs or projects that we've had running over 5 years that largely merged into one big project and then linked in with the Landholders Driving Change, which we'll now call LDC, project because we largely ran the same methodology at several of the LDC sites, which is in the Bowen, Broken and Bogey catchments or Triple B area. So just to set the scene, so I noticed you will all be full of gullies by the end of this session. There are a lot of talks coming, but we're going to start up in the catchment and then move down where Zoe and Steve will take a lot of the information that we'll be presenting, and they move into the marine zone and talk about how the sediments are operating there. Importantly, a lot of the work to identify whether gullies have been an issue has been done in previous research programs over the last 5, 10, 15 years using isotopes, traces and dating work, and we won't be touching on any of that work. Today we're going straight to solutions. We're looking to options for fixing or remediating landscapes and focusing primarily on the Burdekin catchment. The focus is on monitoring and actually trying to get that evidence for whether these things are working or not, because we've done a lot of work in the past, but we actually don't have that critical evidence as yet, but we're well on the way of getting a lot of that evidence now. And I'll hand over to Scott.
Hi everyone, great to see you all again. I guess after 12 months of being apart, it feels a little bit like a school reunion today, so it's great. You're going to hear a fair bit about gullies in this session, and in particular gully monitoring. And I guess I work for an organisation that's been, at the coalface of gully remediation now for about 15 years. So I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes just to give a few, organisational / personal perspectives. I guess the first one is we've come a long way in 15 years. And even in the last 5 years. If we'd done this 5 years ago, it would have been a pretty skinny talk. And I guess in the last 5 years, we've seen quite an advance in terms of our understanding of not only gully processes, but also gully remediation techniques. Through the work of a number of people here, we've seen validation of the contribution of big gullies to fine sediment loads into the GBR. Through the work of Andrew Brooks and others, we've seen a spatial verification of actually where it's actually coming from. So we know where in the landscape are the hotspots. We now have a greatly enhanced understanding. Kind of got to lean up like this to see the thing. We've got a greatly enhanced understanding of the processes, the typology, and importantly for a management organisation like us, the priorities for investment. We've seen a significant investment into big gullies through the likes of Reef Trust, more recently the Reef Trust Partnership with the Foundation, Office of Great Barrier Reef and others. And I think from a management organisation perspective, we've got a real focus around trials with programs particularly focused on trying to tease out cost effectiveness or what I would call the sort of minimum viable product. Where's the sweet spot on that cost curve that you can get away with remediation? And importantly, and I guess that's the topic of Beck today, is a greater investment and priority given to monitoring, which is kind of a good segue. So why do we actually want to do gully monitoring? This is a really key question because gully monitoring is actually very expensive. So you need to get it right. And I guess first and foremost, again, particularly from my perspective, but also from the perspective of investors, it's around evaluating performance and cost effectiveness of remediation techniques. And there's a number of things, when you unpack that, there's a number of things under that. So obviously validation of current practice and guidance, things like the Gully Toolbox, for instance, the effectiveness of remediation techniques, importantly the durability of those. when you're talking about potentially a multi-million-dollar investment into landscape remediation, you actually want it to last. Costing, understanding the costing, and in particular the cost effectiveness of gully remediation is particularly important. Particularly one of the key directions that we're trying to do at the moment is drive down the cost of remediation. Excuse me. And more recently, in the last couple of years, understanding performance and cost effectiveness has fed into emerging environmental markets like reef credits, for instance. That's a management perspective. I guess from the science perspective, monitoring gives us an improved understanding of the processes. The next one doesn't get a lot of attention, but from a management point of view is really important. Monitoring is a critical community engagement tool, and I'll include social licence in there. We could almost, from our experiences over the last few years around large-scale gully remediation, we could almost write a paper, I guess, on the sociology or the community sociology of gully investments. And obviously, if you're going to make large-scale investments, you need to continue to monitor or surveil their integrity and undertake repairs. So I guess some learnings, this is not rocket science really, but some learnings in terms of some of the key considerations around gully monitoring. Monitoring is an integral part of design. It's not an afterthought. And I guess over the last few years we've seen a lot of gully remediation investments designed, but the monitoring comes as an afterthought. I guess harking back to that previous slide, understanding the purposes of your monitoring or fitness for purpose is critical in terms of getting it right. If you're going to invest significant amounts of money over significant lengths of time in monitoring, you don't want to get to the end of it and realise that you've got the monitoring program wrong. It is important to have multiple lines of evidence, particularly, I guess, in these early stages of large-scale gully remediation investments. In our part of the world, we have huge interannual climate variability, so we actually need an appropriate length of record in terms of monitoring. We're talking climate cycles of 5 to 10 years, and that's the sort of scale that ideally we should be monitoring gullies post-remediation. Similarly, the landscapes are highly heterogeneous in our part of the world, and we need significant spatial replication to give us confidence in the results. And finally, and I guess this is one that's dear to us, is closing the loop. So how do we actually take our learnings and understanding from monitoring and actually build those into future decision support? And I think we've still got some way to go in terms of getting that right. I'll hand that back to Beck.
Awesome, thank you, Scott. So just now to the NESP and LDC projects and what we actually did. So Andrew Brooks may or may not be talking about some of the really large-scale gully remediation effectiveness work that they've done in parallel. Our work was slightly different in that we tried to trial some of the cheaper options that farmers may want to take on in their own right without big machines and engineers along the side, right through to some of the bigger remediation works that Scott alluded to. So from cheaper to more expensive. We also tried to look at a range of options from the less invasive to the very invasive, and also look at in the context of landscape repair. So not just putting band-aids around the landscape, but what does it mean for shifting the whole landscape up? We focused on the Burdekin, and we had initially roughly 4 NESP-funded sites, but that ended up being about 7 when we linked in with LDC. So a couple of projects that we ran alongside each other, and we put them together because it made a really rich data set for government to help interpret what the differences were between sites and different remediation treatment options. At each of the sites, importantly, we had a control site that was not treated and a treatment site where a range of things were done, from fencing off only to keep stock out, right through to mine site scale work. We basically tried to measure 3 main attributes at most sites. The vegetation or land condition is a really good early indicator to tell you whether this system is likely to repair itself. We also had a bunch of terrain metrics, which is there in the middle, to see both how much sediment is coming out of these gullies in the first place and then whether we've been able to stop that happening. And then the key metric is the water quality response, which integrates the land and the terrain and expresses as water quality, and that's eventually what gets delivered to the marine system. So at each of these sites, they were all collected. Often these sites are really remote, and thanks again to Damon Telfer and team who used their helicopter to collect a lot of the data for these sites because you can't access once it gets wet. So a little bit different to the cane stories we heard this morning. Some of the richness, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but some of the richness from this data set is getting samples for both sediments and nutrients, and I think we'll hear from Alex later on the nutrient story, but getting data across different gully types and different soil types in the landscape has been really valuable and can help feed into a lot of the catchment models that do the prioritisation work in these areas. We collected a lot of data across 7 sites, huge amount, long reports, too much detail. What I tried to do is collapse it all into one table. Even then, I don't expect you to read that. I'll just give you a snapshot of one attribute, which is the water quality from one site, but just letting you know that's available in the reports, as well as Jane, Andrew and myself have just recently finished a synthesis product, which is quite short. I don't know how long it ended up, maybe 10 pages, which also has the summary, including the Strathalbyn and Crocodile Station sites into this table. So just as a case study, I'm just going to move over here, Mount Wickham, many of you may or may not know, this is sort of the premier site for the LDC down on the Bowen River, just near the Collinsville Hotel. It looked a lot like the top photos early on, lots of tunnel erosion, really nasty gully erosion, and it's now remediated. This is work that we didn't actually do, so this was a partnership with Vatira and Alluvium Consulting, and a lot of engineering design went into it, and now the before and after photos, on the right-hand side there sort of show you what's gone on. What we did was actually the monitoring of that site using the veg terrain and water quality, and I'll just show you some of the early indicator work over the last 3 wet seasons. So the only box plot I'll show, importantly, is that on the right is the treatment site before it was treated, and the control site before it was treated. So first up we see here, this is the sediment concentration. They were different even before we started. Really important point, because often people say, can't we not do it without a control? It's like, well, yeah, you can, you just won't be able to statistically say as much as quickly as you'd like when you do this work. So after year 1, all that work was done with the bulldozers came in, the replanting was undertaken, and we did see a lovely statistical difference at the treatment site. However, and if I'd had no control site there, I would have said you've just had a response. But we didn't. Actually, because we had the control site, we knew most of that response was purely because of climate, and Scott alluded to that earlier. The second year was really, really wet, so we got dilution and saw that response, but we couldn't say that that was due to the treatment that went on in that gully. In the third year, hooray, we can do our Tony Webster happy dance. We did actually get a statistically significant change here. And you can see, picture speaks 1,000 words. On the left up there is that the concentrations took a big dive at the treatment site, whereas at the control it had basically levelled out. And fresh out of the labs, and I fixed this up on the plane last night, the wet season just gone, we're still continuing to see that trend, but interestingly the control is also declining, but it's still statistically significant. So yay, but the good news is we now have some effectiveness values that can be directly linked into those cost effectiveness metrics that drive a lot of the decision making, and we haven't had this before for any process, hill slopes, stream banks or gullies. We have this for a lot of sites now, including the Griffith Uni work that's been done, showing very similar results. So I think overall it's quite exciting. Outcomes and outputs. We have a lot out of this big legacy of work. As I said, the cost effectiveness values, a lot of stakeholders will be using that. The process understanding and the data. So the Queensland Government models, hopefully for that BBB area, will eventually be rerun using some of this data. We've handed it to the marine folk so we can use that for geochemical tracing and for the bioavailable nutrient work of also being able to share some of these samples. As demonstration sites, of course, we've already heard this morning, farmers love seeing data and love seeing data being measured, particularly in their backyard, and that these projects have really enriched that process. And finally, published papers. Jane alluded to it earlier, but the consensus statement and the trust in science for those that were involved in the Senate inquiry earlier this year we must publish this work, and as a CSIRO employee, I can't go to a Senate inquiry and talk about anything that is not peer-reviewed and published. So it's really important that we continue to do that, and those publications continue to come out of this amazing work that's been done in this room. Anyone? Oh, where did that go? That's interesting. That just lots of papers that I'm happy to share if anyone would like copies, and that's it from me. Thank you to all the funders. A lot of time has been put in outside hours on this project, particularly to those on the ground in the field. Late nights, early mornings, helicopter rides at really strange hours of the day and night, people's phones going off all the time, and I'd really like to acknowledge that investment from a big group of people, so thank you.